Now we'll continue and move to diagnostics. And it's my pleasure to announce Professor Vince from Germany. He's more British than German, though. And he's a neurosurgeon now in Aschaffenberg, formerly trained in Würzburg, and spent some sort of holidays in Austria.
4 years, eh?
Okay.
4 years.
Long-term holiday. Now back to Germany. And Professor Vince will talk about intraoperative ultrasound.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you very much. Dear Naren, thank you for the invitation. Dear all, Giordano, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you very much indeed. And my presentation is a lot more simple, so you can all sort of relax now, because we're going to talk about ultrasound, which is really easy. Ultrasound is sound. It's a frequency above 20,000 hertz, above the upper hearing limit of the human ear. And if you use it for diagnostic purposes, your machines offer you several different modes with which you can work. I'm going to present 4 of these modes to you, and we'll start off with the simplest of them all, the amplitude mode, or A mode. Right? It's a simple emitted pulse, and then you record the backscatter of this one-dimensional pulse. But you can already use that to detect lesions or, say, ventricular surfaces, for instance. And B mode, or brightness mode, that is the mode that is most commonly used in neurosurgery, is actually a collection of A modes, and the backscatter of these A modes, and then a computer system interprets it into a grayscale image for you, and that's what we sort of commonly use in the operating theatre. But you can also use Doppler, which is a very valuable tool for depicting blood vessels, for instance. And you can use Doppler to measure particles moving away from your probe or towards your probe. And it's usually color-coded, as you see here. And everything that's moving away from your probe is blue, and everything that is moving towards your probe is usually coded red. It's got nothing to do with arteries or veins, but you can actually measure blood flow within these vessels. Now, if you add the amplitudes together, irrespective of the direction in which the blood is actually moving, if you add these amplitudes together, you wind up with a signal that we call power mode. And that's a very powerful tool for depicting blood vessels, irrespective of the direction of which the blood vessel is actually perfused. Power mode has a much higher sensitivity, so you can see a lot more detail. Now, I was surprised how many different types of machines are on the market, right? These are the 4 sort of leading firms at the moment. And you can go, your hospital can go full Monty and pay the same price as for a fully blown operating microscope. You'll be looking at something like 300,000 euros for a machine like that. But you can also opt for very much simpler machines, more simpler machines like this BK gadget here on the right. You're way below 100,000 euros. And it's a very powerful machine that can get the job done in the operating theatre pretty easily. Now, there are lots of different transducers out there, and it definitely pays to take some time to choose the right transducers for the work that you want to do. The sort of standard form is the linear array, in which you have a lovely sort of rectangular or square image, which is easy to interpret. The disadvantage is that these transducer probes tend to be rather large, and they're sort of used for abdominal work rather than for neurosurgery. And also, they don't penetrate very deeply. The curved arrays, they're sort of very commonly used in neurosurgery also. They offer you a nice sort of compromise between the area that you have to expose and the sector that you can be scanning. And also you get a lot better penetration into the tissue. And my favorite is the phased array probe, which offers you the possibility to electrically steer the ultrasound beam. And also you can compress it so far that you really only need a very small opening in the skull to see a beautiful sector within the brain. These are typically used for burr-hole purposes. Now, generally, the lower the frequency of your probe, the better the penetration into the tissue is, but the lower your resolution, axial and lateral resolution, is going to wind up being. The higher the frequency that you're working with, the better your resolution, but the lower the penetration into the tissue. And 20 megahertz here is a typical frequency for the microdoppler systems, which are small transducer probes that you can come into direct contact with the blood vessel, and you have a scanning depth of about 1 to 2 millimeters, and it's used in aneurysm surgery to determine whether an aneurysm is actually clipped and closed, or whether blood vessels are still perfused. I quite like using this very simple microdoppler system from Mitsuo here, but there are some very elaborate machines on the market that get the job done. This is one of our early images here, scanning at a very high frequency, just to show you how much detail you can actually get out of such an image. This is the brain surface here, scanned at 12 megahertz, and this is a subarachnoid space. And if the beamer allowed, no, you can't. You can see the arachnoid membrane along here, and the blood vessels within the subarachnoid space. So fantastic resolution and image detail. This is sort of an array that most firms will try to sell you. It's a simple curved probe here that I don't like very much, because you can't really judge the sector very well in which you're going to be scanning. And this is a typical phased array probe for burr hole work. Now this is my favorite. It's a simple rectangular form here. It's old school, but and you can buy them phased array as well. I like it because you wind up with an image that is virtually in the distension of your arm. So you're working along the trajectory of your arm, and it gives me a better idea of the sector in which I am working within the brain. Now, the MR images are sort of termed with, or we sort of use densities for CTs, or intensities for MR images. And in ultrasound imaging, we use the term echogenicity, and every sort of anatomical structure will give you a special or a particular signal back again, say hyperechogenic for the falx or hypoechogenic for the brainstem. And this is the terminology that we'll be using. Now, ultrasound needs movement. These simple sort of flat 2D images don't really give you all that much information, but if you move your ultrasound probe, you can develop a very good idea, or you get a very good idea of the lesion that you're dealing with, or small vessels here in the sulcus on the side. But you do need that sort of movement aspect. And the first image that I take, I always take that directly from the dura before I actually open the dura, because it gives me a more sort of a better feeling than working on the surface of the brain. You just get about all the information that you can get out of an MR image, you can get out of an ultrasound image too. You get a low-grade glioma here and a high-grade glioma here. You get this lovely sort of homogeneous aspect of the tumor, just like you do in MR. And in the high-grade gliomas, you get this irregular structure here with the necrotic areas in the middle and the solid tumor around the back. Just about everything that you need out of an MR image, you can get out of an ultrasound image as well. Now, when you're taking a biopsy, you have two options. You can have a larger trephination and then sort of go parallel to your ultrasound probe, or you can have a second burr hole trephination in a different position. Ideal would be 90-degree angle, but that's not always very easy to actually get done. But say 45-degree angle would be sufficient, and you've got a second window through which you can watch whatever you're doing with your biopsy cannula. Now, in this case here, we've got two metastases. We'll be hearing about metastases from Christine later on, I think. And we've got two metastases here, and the plan was to follow along to the first one and then carry on to the second one. You can see one here, and the second one is a bit too dark. And what we did was we, under ultrasonic view, we passed a ventricular catheter through to the first lesion, and then a second catheter to the second lesion, and that protected us from brain shift that you can sort of typically expect. And all we had to do is then work along the ventricular catheter to reach the lesion. It's a very simple way of navigating. And In tumor resection, we sort of commonly use ultrasound not only to detect the extent of the lesion, but also to see how we're getting along with resection. You can see the resection cavity here. And what you have to do is you have to take a few sort of anatomical landmarks before you actually start with resection. And then you sort of use them as reference points and go back to them every time you do the ultrasound scan. And you can see the resection cavity getting larger and larger. You do wind up with this hyperechogenic rim, which is about 1 to 2 millimeters thick. And it's very difficult to sort of say, is that residual tumor here or not? It's a typical phenomenon. It's to do with impedance jumps, and it's to do with reflection on the surface here. There are coupling solutions that will reduce this effect, but it is a bit of a problem. You've got to sort of take that into account. So for tumor work, ultrasound is a great help. It will show you the lesion. It will help you judging vessels that go into the lesion or go past the lesion. You reduce the risk of damaging tissue on the way down to whatever you want to do. Now, there are two contrast medias on the market nowadays. One is based on small iron particles, so-called myons, that are used in liver diagnostics, for instance. And then there are these hexafluoride microbubbles like SonarView. This is one that you can actually buy for ultrasound purposes. You are not allowed to use them in the brain, but there is no sort of proven data that they actually do help. But you can see an ultrasound image here, low-grade glioma down here, and a low-grade glioma, the same tumor, after contrast media. You can actually pick out small blood vessels that you just couldn't see before with the help of these bubble particles. And here, ultrasound of a mid-cerebral artery aneurysm. You can see the aneurysm here. This is before contrast, and this is after contrast in power mode. And you can actually see small perforating vessels leaving the mid-cerebral artery there. In aneurysm surgery, it's a standard tool for me to use power mode. And this is an anterior communicating aneurysm here. And the A2 blood vessels here. If you tilt your probe, you can actually follow the A2 segments quite easily. And post-clipping, you can follow them to see that they're both patent. So that does help you quite a bit in judging whether or not you've actually achieved what you want to do, clip the aneurysm, and make sure that the distal blood vessels are all still perfused. And you can even use it here. This is an arteriovenous malformation, an angioma, occipital angioma that we treated. This was partially embolized, and the embolization material shows up hyperechogenically, and you can use that to sort of navigate your way around the lesion as well. Another angioma here, small nidus here. This is hemorrhage that went with the angioma. You can see the small hemorrhage here, look. And you can use the Doppler feature of the ultrasound to differentiate between feeding blood vessels, where the velocity is typically a lot higher than in transitory vessels, where speed is a lot lower. And these feeders tend, obviously, to point towards the nidus of the lesion that you're dealing with, and these transitory ones, they don't. So power mode won't give you this information, but it does show you the nidus and these blood vessels in the vicinity. So in neurovascular work, it's a great help. You can identify lesions and vessels. You can make sure that you've actually removed whatever you want to. You can differentiate between feeding blood vessels and transitory blood vessels. Now, when you're placing ventricular catheters, you want it to wind up in the right frontal horn, typically. And it's got to be, in emergency situations, it's got to be quick, it's got to be reliable, and we sort of commonly use anatomical reference points on the skull, and then we have a few numbers with which we can sort of make things a bit more definite. But you'd be surprised where these catheters can wind up. This is a study here from Pittsburgh, feedback of 900 neurosurgeons, placing over 1,700 ventricular catheters, and multiple passes were needed in 50% of cases. And these were all SAH cases with dilated ventricles. On average, 2.17 passes needed to actually hit the ventricle. And in emergency cases here, this is a Chinese study, only 63% of the catheters in emergency situations were actually located ideally within the right frontal horn. And there are a good number of studies out there that show you where these catheters can wind up when you're under pressure and it's in the middle of the night. It gets a lot more complicated, obviously, if you're placing these ventricular catheters for shunt systems, where the shunt is supposed to sort of perform over years. The position of your catheter is very, very important for shunt survival. And this study shows that you have a significant increase of revisions needed if the catheter is not positioned correctly within the frontal horn. So it obviously makes sense to use some form of navigation for your ventricular catheters. There are some very simple constructions on the market, like this one here. There's even ones where your iPhone is integrated. But obviously, the simplest form of navigation would be just to use ultrasound. And this is the phased array probe that we use in Aschaffenberg here. It's from Aloka. I don't really like it very much because you've got a different angle between the sectum that you're scanning and the handle that you're holding. But it can be used to depict the ventricular system and to hit the ventricle. It's actually supposed to be used with this clip system here that sort of counteracts for this angle. But it's far better just to use a straight probe, in my eyes. Yeah, and there are a good number of studies. I've got all the PDFs if anyone's interested in it. A good number of studies that show you that using some form of navigation, or in this case, ultrasound navigation, significantly increases your chances of hitting the ventricle with the first pass. And also in shunt surgery, it reduces the chances of revision surgery needed within the first 6 months. One step further is a special A-mode stylet that can be inserted into the ventricular catheter here, and you get a backscatter that is registered, and you can actually see the position of your catheter within the brain. And then, just so you've heard about it, this is an intracavitary ultrasound system that can be used in combination with endoscopes. And it's been used in the evacuation of hematomas to assess how much blood was still left in there. You have to integrate ultrasound into your sort of general workflow, and you've got to be very careful where to sort of put your machines. You can integrate the ultrasound image straight into your neuro navigation device, which makes sense because the MR image can virtually then interpret your ultrasound plane that you're working in, and you've got a sort of a cross-reference here that makes things a bit more secure. This is the setup, my setup in Aschaffenberg. We've got the neuronavigation here, ultrasound here. The head's supposed to be here. And I like to have it so I can see my hand, the probe, and the screen at the same time, because that gives me a better idea of the sector in which I am working. One step further still, this is an excellent gadget. It's an ultrasound-based neuronavigation system from one of my mentors and heroes in ultrasound, from Geimund Unsgaard in Trondheim. This machine is an ultrasound-based neuronavigational system that does everything that you want. It's a fantastic idea. It worked very well, but they couldn't sell enough units, and they had to close down shop in 2015, I think. This is his group here, and they've been able to show the many advantages that this system has over its competitors. Now, I've only got 2 minutes left, but just so you've heard about it as well, tissue harmonic imaging is a modern technique which enhances the quality of your images, because everyone's sort of criticizing the quality of ultrasound images, but the question is, what information do you actually need, but also how can I improve the image that I'm working with? And tissue harmonic imaging is an interesting and pretty simple technique. If your ultrasound probe is emitting a signal at, say, 3 megahertz, then typically it's sort of reflected back at exactly that frequency. There are sort of slight differences, but not really. But you do also have harmonic overtones, just like on a guitar string or a piano string. And they come back at sort of at potential, so 3, 6, 12, 24, and so on. And these harmonic overtones have carry far less artifacts. They're a purer signal, if you like. And with the help of software or special filters, you can filter out this fundamental noise here and just take out the harmonic sound that comes back to your probe, and that increases the quality of your image. I hope that this beamer will be able to show you this. Low-grade glioma, tissue harmonic imaging on here and off here. This is the insula and the cistern in the insula here, and you can see a lot more detail. You can't see it very well here, look, but here you can. Low-grade glioma in the insula here. So it's a pretty simple tool that actually improves your image quite a bit. This is a fetus on and off, and you can see a lot more detail using this technique. 3D ultrasound can also be a great help. You can integrate it into your neuronavigation device. There are two ways in which you can get a 3D image. Either you move your probe, or you have a sensor on your probe, or you use a phased array in which the sector is actually moved electronically. And this is a meningioma in our department here in 3D with these mid-cerebral artery branches in power mode here on the side. This is an excellent paper for anyone who's interested that collects a great number of tips of how to set yourself up in the operating theatre and things that you can do wrong and how to get better quality out of your images. So future perspectives, just a really quick one here. Functional ultrasound imaging is on its way. You can measure blood perfusion on the brain surface and use that. Elastography is the technique with which brain shift is corrected in neuronavigational systems when you integrate your ultrasound image. There is interventional ultrasound is now very en vogue. No one really knows in which way that's going to develop. It's definitely not much of a competition to, say, deep brain stimulation techniques, but it can be used to treat Parkinson's. It's irreversible, and that's part of the problem of this technique. And that's my last slide here. So it's a highly effective technique. I can recommend it to anyone. You do have a learning curve, not to worry, but don't give up on it. You've really got to sort of stick by it and use it every time you're in theatre. And image quality is definitely on its way up. And I don't think we're very far off from MRI quality or information. Thank you very much.
And highly interesting.
Thank you.
Are there any questions? Yes, please.
I just want to congratulate you because I'm completely sold on ultrasound as well.
Yeah.
And again, I've seen Professor Umsgaard in this course. I do use the Sonor one, although it's not in production anymore. I now can't do without it. So, but I think that my question to you is, I think there's a lot more space for ultrasound to move into in its advances, and I wonder where you saw the future of it.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think that I would like to see it sort of integrated into standard neuronavigation systems on a sort of routine basis, and that is still quite sort of a tedious job because you have to reference the probe and you have to have a phantom with which you can reference the probes. I'd like to see that workflow get a lot easier. So you've got your sort of standard navigation system, but the ultrasound is seamlessly integrated into it. I think that's definitely a step that needs to be taken. Functional ultrasound is very promising, but that still is quite a job to do in theatre, and you do need a neuropsychologist on board and all the rest of it. But that is definitely something that we ought to be looking at. Yes, yes.
Are there any further questions? No, can't see any. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming.